Hi everybody, it's Courtney, and today we are going to be making a card using the Posh Poinsettia stamp set by Simon Hurley Create. So I'm taking a piece of stark white cardstock here, and I'm taking about 3/4 of an inch off of one side to make this kind of a thinner panel. I want this to be more of the shape of a door. We're going to be creating a door. So I line this up in my mini Missy here, and I'm just going to be using the outline wreath image as well as the bow. So I'm going to lay my wreath down where I want it, and then lay my bow down because the bow is going to be part of the wreath or on top of the wreath. So that will need to be stamped first. Then I could just remove that wreath image and go ahead and stamp out my bow. I'm also stamping this onto a piece of masking paper, and I'll fussy cut that out and place that down because remember, anything that is in front of another will need to be stamped and masked first. So I'm not doing any ink blending here, so I don't need my mask to be perfect. I just need to cover up the image so that it looks like one image once we're done. So I can line back up my wreath and go ahead and stamp that out. I am stamping with Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink. I ended up stamping both of these images twice. This is the first time I'm using this stamp set, and sometimes we don't get the greatest impression the first time we use it. So just stamping it twice will give me that bold black outline. Now we're going to create our door. So I'm keeping this nice and simple. I've done this before in other videos. I just haven't made it the entire card. So if you look at most doors, most front doors on a house, you'll see that they have those little sections, like the indentations. So that's basically what I'm creating. I'm using my T-square ruler and a pencil here just to get my lines right before I make anything permanent. So I'm just going to do with the pencil, I'm just going to create the rectangles basically. And I know that I have my image in the way. I probably should have done this first and then stamped my image, and I could have just erased my excess lines there, but I didn't. I wasn't thinking too far ahead. But once I was happy with where my little sections of the door are, then I can make these permanent, just being careful not to go directly over my image. So I'm going to be using an EK Success journaling pen, which I have to thank so many of you because these are no longer being made or being sold. So whatever is on the shelves is it. They're not making these anymore. And I absolutely love these pens. And there's been a couple of you who have found them in your local craft stores and have sent them to me. So I do have some EK Success journaling pens to last me a little bit. So I'm very thankful for that. But if you are not able to find the EK Success journaling pens, you can use any Copic safe pen here. But I'm basically just going to go over those pencil lines that I have already created once I'm happy with the placement of them. Now, once I have my rectangles, if you take a look at a door, or some doors anyway, they're kind of indented twice, kind of. There's kind of like a rectangle within a rectangle. So I'm also creating those as well. Now, I didn't do this with the pencil first just because I figured I could eyeball this, and for the most part I did. It wasn't perfect, no, but once you have everything put together, any imperfections are pretty much going to be hidden. Don't forget, your recipient of the card is going to look at the card as a whole. They're not going to look for every mistake that you made or any error that you made, because most likely you're probably going to be the only one to be able to spot that out because you know exactly where it is. So don't stress perfection when it comes to handmade anything. So once I was happy with the placement of all of my little rectangles there, we are going to move on to the coloring. You will want to make sure that obviously you remove the mask and you're going to want to erase any pencil lines that you have left behind. Once you do any kind of coloring or ink blending over those pencil lines, they're nearly impossible to get rid of. So I am going to be using some E markers for the door. Well, for everything. But I'm going to start with my lightest color here, and I am going to kind of just map out where my darkest areas are going to be. So I am going to have my darkest area be on the outside of each one of these rectangles. So on the outside of the inner rectangle and the outside of the kind of like the frame looking area, but this is a small area, so you want to make sure that you're just using the tip of your marker so that you can get multiple colors in there and get that contrast. In order to get that those multiple colors in those small little areas, you just want to make sure that your marker is pretty much straight up and down, and that's how you'll be able to just kind of use the tip of the marker. I'm also going to add a little bit of a shadow underneath the wreath. This is where I realized I forgot to, there's a hole in the wreath, and I forgot to continue my rectangles through the whole of the wreath because obviously you'd see those. So I am just going to finish those up and then also add a little bit of a shadow to the inside of the wreath. And of course, I'm just going to work with the center light source here because that's the easiest. So I plan on putting some shadows on either side of the door. Next, I can go in with my darkest color, which is the E59, and I'm pretty much just going over those shadow areas within these rectangles. So like I said, in the inner rectangle, I can add a little bit more pressure because I have a larger area to work with, but on that outer frame type of rectangle, you can see that my marker is pretty much straight up and down, and that's how I'm going to get that contrast within such a small area. Now, I am not going to use this color for the shadow underneath the wreath itself, just because I feel like it's a little bit too dark and I don't need to add that much of a shadow. So I'll save that for my darkest midtone, but I am going to use this color to add a little bit of shading to either side of the door. So on both ends, and I'm pretty much just doing straight lines. You can use flick lines if you like, whatever is easier for you, but I figured this will make it look more like wood grain. You could have done the wood grain texture, but I just kept it nice and easy. So next I'm going to move on to the E57, and I'm going to extend these shadows out on each one of these little rectangles. Once again, when I work with that outer frame or that outer rectangle, making sure that my marker is pretty much straight up and down. Now with this color, this is where I'm going to go in and add those shadows underneath the wreath itself. So I'm not going to add it around the entire wreath. It would mainly be towards the bottom. So I'm just outlining the wreath kind of maybe not even quite halfway up from the bottom of it, and also underneath the bow and underneath the top section. So the inside of the wreath, that would also cast a shadow. Also going to extend these areas out on either side of the door and then move on to the E55. And I'm not doing anything different here except for extending these areas out a little bit further, including the shadow that we had placed underneath the wreath, both the inside and out, and extending the shadows on either side of the door. Finally, we will go back to the E53, which is the color that we started with to kind of map everything out. And this is where I'm going to fill in any remaining areas. Now, you'll have to be careful, and this goes for pretty much any time you're doing any kind of alcohol marker coloring. When you go in with your lightest color, remember, the lighter the color, the more it will act as a colorless blender. And for those of you who use alcohol markers, you'll know that the colorless blender does not blend. It doesn't erase color like some people believe it does, but it moves it. So yeah, it's great to fix coloring mistakes, but you're only fixing those coloring mistakes because you're moving that color back into the image where it needs to be. You're not erasing it. So when I am kind of being a little careless here, I went over the darkest area, or touched the darkest area with this lighter color and kind of dragged out some of that color towards the bottom of the door. I'm not even sure if you guys are able to see it on camera, but it's there. And I will just place my sentiment there once everything is all said and done to kind of mask that. You'll still be able to see it, but it won't be quite as noticeable. So you just want to make sure that you're a little bit careful with your lightest colors to kind of stick to those lighter areas and not go too far beyond them, because you will drag out those darker colors. So now that my door is done, we're going to move on to the wreath itself. So I'm going to, there's lots of bits and pieces to the wreath. And by the way, this is a layering stamp set. I just chose to color it instead because you guys know me. I prefer to color. So I'm going to start off with some YG90 markers. And I'm going to start with my lightest color and I'm going to fill in the entire thing. I'm just going around the images. Some of the images, like these little berries, I'm not too concerned if I go over because I know I'm going to be using a darker color for those anyway, and I'll be able to cover up the area. Now, to add some texture, I am going to add little dots. So I'm going to go in with my darkest E90 marker and start just adding dots. Again, I'm just using the tip of the marker and I'm kind of just adding them everywhere. They're a little bit spread out. They're not too close together, but as I move down to the lighter colors, I will make these closer together. So I'll move on to the YG97, create more dots going directly over the YG99 dots, but just leave them a little bit closer together. Same thing with the YG95, going directly over the same areas, but these are much closer together. There's not a whole lot of space left in between the dots. And then I can finish back off with that YG91 that we started with, and I'm just going to go over everything. So that those dots are, you can still see the dots, it just gives it some texture, but it tones it down. Remember, it's a lighter color, so it's going to move those colors around a little bit and kind of tone them down, lighten them up, and kind of just leave behind the texture. So next we are going to move to a different green combination, and I'm going to color the leaves of the poinsettias with these. And I am just going to add 3 colors here. There's not a whole lot of area to work with. I'm going to go right in with my darkest color to avoid any bleeding, being I've done a whole lot of coloring so far. I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to the base of the leaf and kind of blend that out to the lightest color being on the tip. Now for these little sprig looking things, I'm just going to use one solid color. They're very tiny. You do not have to add shading to every little bit and piece. Going to do the same thing with the pine cones. There's already a whole lot of lines and detail to them already that I don't necessarily have to add any shading with the coloring. Next, we're going to move on to the reds. I use the same red combination for the bow as well as the poinsettias, but I'm only going to show you the bow because I colored the flowers the same way as I did with the leaves that I've already showed you. So like always, I'm going to start with my lightest color because I want to map out where my darkest areas will be. Now there's a lot of folds to this bow. So I want to make sure that my bow is darkest where it's kind of bunched together in the center. Also where one little part of the bow is overlapping another, and in the center I started putting the shadow in the center of the center, but that's not right. It would be on the outside of the center, and also where you can see the inside of the ribbon, so where it's kind of folded over to make the loop. In the inside of the loop, that would be the darkest because it's inside. So I'm putting the darkest color and a mid-tone there, but I'm not leaving any area for the lightest color in that particular section. Not that there's room for that anyway. So going in with the darkest color now and pretty much just going over those areas that I've already mapped out. You just want to be careful with the reds. I've done a whole lot of coloring. This is pretty much the last step to the coloring, and I want to make sure that my reds don't bleed. Reds bleed a lot, so do RV markers, sometimes even the darker V markers bleed a lot. So you want to make sure that you're not oversaturating the paper. If you're not getting the perfect blend, that is okay. Just leave it that way. The more you try to blend it, the more saturated the paper will be, and the more likely it is to bleed. And once these colors bleed over your coloring that you've already done, there's really no way to completely get rid of it. So you just want to make sure that you're not going to oversaturate it. So I blended those out with the midtones, and now I'm going to finish off with the lightest color. Again, making sure that I don't go over that darkest area with the lightest color. I don't want to move that color around. For the little berries that are on the wreath, I started with the darkest color and realized that once I added that, it looked a little bit too brown instead of red. So it's literally just a dot. So I took the the R46 and went over that and kind of brightened that up a little bit. So I colored, like I said, the poinsettias the same way. Now I am just going to add my doorknob. And I'm not going to use a marker for this. I'm going to go back to my EK Success journaling pen just because I don't want to add any Copic marker over this. Like I said, Copics blend. That's what they do. Alcohol markers blend. So if I put this over my coloring, it may not really look right. So I'm just going to add a circle and fill that in. So next we can go ahead and assemble the card. So I'm going to take a flat card panel here, and this is Nina Solar White 80 pound, and I just grabbed it from my stash. I probably should have grabbed another piece of the Stark White because it would have worked a little bit better. It would be a little bit sturdier, but I didn't. So I am going to create kind of a border here, and I didn't really have any idea of how I was going to do this until I started putting it together. So I laid the panel down, my door down, and figured out how much room I have on each side. Then I'm taking my T-square ruler here, measuring that out, and just kind of creating a border on both sides of this card panel. This is going to remain a flat card panel. So I'm taking my pencil and then my EK Success journaling pen, which I kind of wish I didn't add, but once it's there, it's there. And then I am just going to add a little bit of color. I don't want to leave this completely white, so I'm going to do some very, very light ink blending on either side. I'm going to use the Gur ink by Simon Hurley Create, and I love these inks because you can really have a lot more control over how light or dark you want your ink blending to be. You can see that I'm starting off on my scrap piece of paper. That's where most of my ink is going to, and I'm kind of just bringing that to the paper just to add a little bit of color and a little bit of dimension, concentrating obviously the edges of the card panel being a little bit darker. So I'm not adding a ton of ink here, and that is what I love about, well, one of the things I love about these inks is I could go over this a lot and make this super dark, or I can really have a subtle look to it, which is what I was going for. So next I am going to take a card base. This is just one of the card bases I have in my stash because I pre-make all of my card bases and card panels beforehand. But I lied because next I'm actually going to stamp the sentiment. Going to just stamp that with archival ink because it is sitting on my desk, and that is the first thing I grabbed, and that will go directly over that little streaky area that I have on my door. Now I'm going to take the card base and I am going to cut this down. So this is going to be the same size as my door itself. So the door is actually going to be where the card opens and closes. So I'm going to use my Tombow Mono Multi Glue and adhere that right down to that small little card base that we have created. Now you want to make sure that you don't leave any white outline on this like I normally do with card bases, but I don't want any of my card base to be showing. I want this to be just looking like a door. And next I can, well, I use the Nina Solar White 80 pound for this card panel, and it's just not sturdy enough. So I'm just going to glue another one to the back of it. Just if you guys try to make something like this, then just use a heavy weight. It'll give it a little bit more stability. Then finally, I can adhere my door to that flat panel or flat base, whatever you want to call it. Again, I'm going to use my Tombow Mono Multi Glue because this will give me some time to kind of shift things around, make sure that everything is lined up. And that is it. That is the card for today. Well, I did add a little bit of shimmer. I finished off with a Spectrum Noir shimmer pen on top of the bow, as well as some of the miscellaneous areas on the wreath. But that one is it. So today I am collaborating with Jess, who is actually part of the Simon Hurley Create team as well. I will leave a link to her video below, so please go check her out. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and I will see you again tomorrow. Have a great day. Bye.